Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Pissarro. I'm the Policy Director for the Watershed Institute. Thank you for registering and attending our Guide to Regional Watershed Improvement Plans. So we'll be going through this. If you don't know the Watershed Institute, we're an environmental organization in central New Jersey. Keeping water clean, safe, and healthy is the heart of our mission. And we do that through various aspects, but conservation, advocacy, science, and education. Webinar logistics. We are recording this. We will send you a link to the recording, and it will be available on our YouTube channel and our website. We will provide you a copy of the presentation. There's always a question, will we get the slides? Yes, you will. If you have a question, please use the question and answer feature on Zoom, and we will take those questions as they pop up during the webinar. We're going to do something different. Instead of holding them all to the end as we go through it, I'll try to address questions and talk about it. And then I'm so thankful to our two co-speakers here. Jim Parvis is the municipal engineer for Lawrence Township, and Mark Herman is the township engineer for Montgomery Township. Both of them have been involved in at least one of a regional approach that the Watershed Institute has been organizing over the last couple years. Jim has been lucky to be involved in the Stony Brook watershed approach, as well as the Assunpink, and then Mark with the Lower Millstone. So Jim and Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Mike.
Yeah. So what is this watershed improvement plan? So in 2023, DEP updated its municipal separate storm sewer system permit, the MS4 permit that all municipalities have, and they've had it since 2004. But in 2023, DEP updated it to create these watershed improvement plans. And the goal of the watershed improvement plan are a few, but it is to improve water quality by reducing contribution of pollutant parameters found in a total maximum daily load, to improve water quality by reducing contributions of pollutant parameters causing water quality impairments, and to reduce or eliminate stormwater flooding. So 3 big goals, and we'll talk about what those really mean. But come on, no. So the watershed improvement plan, again, all municipalities have to do it. They have it broken up into phases. A watershed inventory report, which is due at the end of this year. So all municipalities should have been working over the last 2.5 years at this point, starting to pull that down. We'll start talking a little bit about that. The watershed assessment report, which theoretically starts in January 1st of 2006 and is due at the end of December 2026. And we'll focus a lot about that. And then the watershed improvement plan report, which is sort of the final plan, due at the end of 2027. So the guide to regional watershed improvement plans really involve ourselves in those last 2 phases. But just from an inventory report, so municipalities over this 3-year period are supposed to pull together a bunch of information. Where are all their stormwater outfalls? Where does that water come from? Where does that water go? What streams are they going to? What's the classification of those streams? So New Jersey allocates or classifies streams in multiple ways. Most ones are what we call FW2, freshwater 2. And then there are some designations within that. Category 1 waters are some of our best protected waters. They have 300-foot buffers and have higher standards. You have trout maintenance and trout production waters, and then you have your regular old FW2 waters that have slightly less protections. You have Pinelands waters, but so municipalities have to understand what waters they're discharging to, because that may impact what you have to do to clean. Um, Now, our stormwater systems are all these interconnected systems sometimes, and municipalities have to figure out who are they connected to, who's connected to them, where's all that water coming from, where are all the inlets? So those grates you see in the streets, those inlets, where are they? Where do they go? And then what waters have a total maximum daily load or TMDLs. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides. Where are your impairments? Where are your overburdened communities? Where's your impervious surfaces, which is where a lot of the stormwater runoff gets generated. And where are all of your stormwater management best management practices, BMP? So where are all your basins, rain gardens, swales, ditches? Where is it in both publicly and privately owned? So there's a lot to do there. Municipalities have been, most, if not all, been working on it and should be done by the end of this year. The watershed assessment report. So you've done your inventory, you know where your impairments are, you know where your TMDLs are, you know where your universe of stormwater systems are, and you have to develop projects. Assuming you have impaired waters, and spoiler alert, most of New Jersey has impaired waters, uh, how are you going to improve those impairments? And impairments just mean water pollution has caused water not to meet designated uses, is not clean enough for recreation or aquatic life or drinking water. I'll talk a little more about that. But so come up with these projects, come up with the reductions required by these TMDLs, provide a feedback process to to your residents, to the public. Here's our plan. What do you think? Where are you going to get the money to build all of this stuff? And then an estimate of the schedule. When are these projects going to go in? So this first 5 years from the permit, 2023 to the end of 2027, is really just a planning process. What do we have? What do we need? When are we going to do it? And then the projects, the things that the watershed improvement plan determine will come in the future. But what's that schedule? And then the final watershed improvement plan report, you take all of your, oops, sorry, duplicate slide, but you take all your feedback, you finalize your report, you figure out what permits you need for these projects. And again, you finalize sort of your schedule. So that's what a watershed improvement plan is. But why do we need them? What's important here? And why do we have to reduce flooding? I think just from a public health and safety, most people think we should be reducing flooding. The water quality aspects is the legal hook why DEP can put into the permit and require municipalities to do this. And flooding is the benefit municipalities get um, to reduce the impacts to their communities, the damage that is caused by extreme weather events, or not even extreme weather events. Uh, so two things. You got flooding on the bottom right picture there. That is a picture of Trenton after Ida. And then the sort of middle picture is what we call a harmful algal bloom, a HAB that occurred in the Millstone River in 2022. HABs are toxic and can cause some significant issues to human health and animal life. So just a little background. Um, we care about water pollution in 1972 in response to the fact that we had flammable rivers, which, not being a scientist, even I know that's probably not a good thing. We passed as a nation the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act had a couple sort of key points, and it's a large statute, but it's important that we restore and maintain the chemical, biological, and physical integrity of our nation's waters. that we were going to stop discharging pollution into our navigable waters by 1985, and that we would restore our water quality by 1983. Um, I put both dates in red because, spoiler alert, we sort of missed those deadlines. One wonders back in 1972 whether these deadlines were ever reasonable, but 22, 40 years later, we didn't make it. And so that's federal. New Jersey has a very similar statute, the Water Pollution Control Act. Again, the goal is restoring, enhancing, and maintaining the health of our waterways, not only for the life that lives in it, but for us as well as our scenic values. And it's also important, DEP has regulations that implement the Water Pollution Control Act and the Clean Water Act, but again, the policy of the state to restore and maintain our waters, and that there's a directive that we shall achieve those designated uses as soon as technically and economically feasible. And we've done a huge amount, since the 70s to reduce the impacts of water pollution from industrial facilities, wastewater treatment plants. We've even done a lot from a stormwater perspective, but not enough. So I talked about impaired waters when this began. Impaired waters, New Jersey, as part of the federal program, monitors and reports on the health of our waters every 2 years. This was the latest report that got finalized, the New Jersey Integrated Water Quality Assessment Report, where they monitor a lot of our water. Not every water, not every stream, not every river is monitored, but those that are, and it's almost 1,000 segments for aquatic life. 665 of those almost 1,000 units or segments were not healthy enough, did not meet the standards, had too much pollution. So it was not healthy enough for aquatic life, the bugs and other aquatic life that lives there. Same thing for recreation. So that orange in those charts means it's not meeting attainment. Very little of our water overall is meeting those standards. And so once the water is impaired, what happens is the Department of Environmental Protection is supposed to create these total maximum daily loads. And that basically is, we euphemistically call them a pollution budget. How much pollution can I put into a waterway and that waterway still meet standards? How much pollution can go into a stream and yet still be healthy enough for the aquatic life that lives in there, safe enough for recreation, etc. We figure out how much that is. And just by the way, the map of the state of New Jersey is a map of all of the TMDLs that exist in the state. So there is a couple parts of the state that do not have a TMDL that covers it, but not a lot. And here's just sort of that allocation of pollution. So what happens is, this is from a Raritan Basin TMDL. We take that budget. We know how much pollutants, in this case, this is total suspended solids. How much total suspended solids, dirt, sediment, brake dust, etc., can go into a waterway. And we know, wastewater treatment plants, that's the WWTP, doesn't really release a lot of that. They're more of a nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus. But we know from a stormwater perspective, from a residential development, from an urban development perspective, we know that we can put in, just a little over 500 pounds of TSS into those waterways and meet standards. We know that when this TMDL was developed, for example, from residential land cover, we were putting in over 1,600 pounds a day or kilograms a day into our streams. Only 258 could go in. And so from a residential land cover perspective, we had to reduce that loading by 84%. And so that's the TMDL. That's what the municipalities have to come and figure out. How do I reduce our loading by that percentage. And it's a little more complicated than that, but that's the general concept. And so these watershed improvement plans are brand new again, only came into existence in 2023. And the reason they came into existence, once you have a TMDL, all permits that discharge pollution into a waterway have to implement those reductions. And the MS4 permit that every municipality has is a discharge permit. We call them the gypties in New Jersey. But because it is a discharge permit, it has to integrate those TMDLs and address them. We had not been doing that up until 2023. And that's why the whips are new and why, we're now working through this process. Other states have done this for many years. The biggest one that comes to mind is the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, where you have 5 states working towards reducing those TMDL pollution loadings. But New Jersey's now jumped on it and is working towards it. So, and here's why sort of, I'm gonna jump back for 1 second. Let me jump back. So each town, and you have 21 counties, and you can sort of see the town outlines in this map. If each town has to come up with these watershed improvement plans, there's going to be 565 of them. But yet we know streams traverse multiple municipalities, multiple counties. And if we come up with 565 different plans, how is that going to work? How is that going to actually achieve the goals of reducing water pollution, improving water quality, and reducing flooding? So to sort of bring it down on a sort of micro level, this at the bottom left is the Upper Millstone watershed. So it starts in Millstone Township and flows through 10 municipalities in 3 counties, and ends at Carnegie Lake. It also has a TMDL with that reductions. So sort of the question and why we think a regional approach makes a lot more sense is, so the Upper Millstone has to reduce, from a stormwater perspective, 84% of the existing loading. It's got to drop from 1,615 kilograms of TSS to 258. How do you allocate that between 10 towns? How do you allocate that between 3 counties? And also, not only do municipalities have to do this, counties may have to do this. The highway agencies, so the county road department, the state DOT, also have to come up with these plans because they have county roads, they have state roads through these. So how do you allocate that sort of 84% reduction between the 10 towns? And if Cranberry says, I'm only responsible for 5% of that 84, and Millstone is responsible for 15%, and Millstone thinks they're responsible for only 2%, and Cranberry's 10%, you have plans now that are developed that aren't consistent with each other. I've been saying, if you have a group project and you have 10 members in your group project and none of the members talk to each other, at the end of the day, at the presentation, how is that going to work out? I suspect we will be in a place where we haven't really reduced water pollution and we don't reduce flooding. So what we have sort of thought about is, and also the Stony Brook, Jim has been involved with the Stony Brook since this process began in 2022, I believe, where we have 2 counties and 6 towns. Again, sort of the same thing. How do we allocate those reductions, impairments? So we have those water quality impairments, but when we monitor, we don't monitor on municipal borders. So they might be in the middle of a town and may not even be in a town at all. How do we allocate those impairments? Again, here's the Stony Brook one. How do we go from 1,500, almost 1,500 kilograms to 245 between the 6 towns? So we believe the regional approach makes more sense. Those 6 towns joined together, and 4 of those 6 towns actually did in March of this year join together and decided to develop a regional watershed assessment report plan and regional improvement plan. Um, but we believe the regional approach makes more sense. DEP, when they proposed and adopted the MS4 permit, also believed that a regional approach made more sense. So they've put into various documents. It's an ideal opportunity for a more regional approach to be developed with multiple municipality collaboration. And the department prefers and encourages the WIPs to be developed on a regional basis. They can't require it because each town has their own permit, but they can encourage it. And again, just another support from DEP that we would prefer regional versus individual. So, as I said, we believe developing these plans on a regional basis makes a lot more sense. We think you will end up with a product that will cost less to develop. And overall, if we identify projects over a region, you will have a less cost instead of each town developing their own projects. So if you have a town with a lot of impervious cover, their opportunities to do projects are a lot less. They may have to remove impervious cover. They may have to build a lot of bioretention or rain gardens. On the other hand, towns that are more suburban or rural, which have vacant land or naturalized land, can improve those lands. They can improve the buffers to our streams. They can enhance our wetlands and get a lot bigger bang for your buck. But uh, not everyone's jumping to this, and so the thought is, how do we encourage those regional processes? Again, as I mentioned, Stony Brook towns in March of 2020, 2025, I'm sorry, this year, all signed on the dotted line to pursue a regional approach for the Stony Brook. Um, Jim has also been involved in the Assunpink, where there's 11 towns pulling together to do that. We're working through that process. Mark has been involved in the Upper Millstone. I'm sorry, not the Upper Millstone, the Lower Millstone, of bringing those towns together. And actually, Montgomery Township applied for a grant to do a regional approach, a watershed management plan for the Lower Millstone. Um, but pulling together the towns, pulling together the stakeholders, there's a lot to do. So we've developed this guide to sort of replicate what we have done, lessons learned, some thoughts from some of the experts and people involved in this process. And hopefully we can replicate how this works. So one of the first things you do when we sort of pull this together is figure out what is the region. What is the region we're going to look at? What's the region we're going to develop the plan for? How are we going to do this? So how do you determine the appropriate watershed to do this? So here's the Raritan Basin. Uh, so the Stony Brook, the upper and lower Millstone all drain into the Raritan. There's the south branch of the Raritan. There's the, um, so this is multiple counties, and I think it's like 100 different towns. Um, Trying to organize 100 towns to meet and discuss probably is not going to work. 6 you can do, mostly 10 or 11, 13 you can do. I would suggest 100 some towns probably is a little too big of a basin, and not only from a logistics perspective, but the issues over that large region are very different. This is a portion of the upper Stony Brook. It covers maybe 2 towns, maybe three, very few small sections of 2 of them. That's probably too small for a region. Um, it's not a very large area. You don't really have a lot of bang for your buck. And then, just again as an example, the Stony Brook, 6 towns, a lot easier to manage. You also have a TMDL for the Stony Brook, so very easy. So you can look at the TMDLs that exist. Is there a TMDL for that multiple municipality watershed? If yes, that might work. Um, I know Jim and Mark, this is sort of the more public participation aspects. Do you have any thoughts on sort of figuring out what the region is? Oops.
Um, at least from Montgomery's standpoint, we kind of got a little lucky where we only have one watershed to deal with. Montgomery is entirely in the lower Millstone. But when we start looking across our borders, we just looked at the entire watershed as a whole, and there's 13 in there. So, I mean, to me, a starting point would be you go with that and you see who you can get participation from. I I kind of agree with what you said before, whereas if you go to something like the scale of 100 municipalities, it's probably not going to happen. Even, getting above that 10 can get a little challenging, but, the lower the number, it's probably a little easier. Um, but I definitely concur the challenges will increase the more you have involved.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I mean, I think, it worked well for us with the Stony Brook group. We had 6 people that could have participated. We got 4. And that's working, very well. We engaged the engineers and the administrators in the towns, and they were able to work together pretty efficiently. We're trying on the Assunpink, and as you said, with 11 towns, definitely more challenging. We're struggling a little bit, but I think it's the right size, and if we could pull it together, I think it could be a great project.
Yeah, yes. Um, so yeah, and I pulled up the Q&A a little bit lately. Um, we were lucky. One of the things the Watershed Institute has sort of started the process with pulling together the Assunpink, the Stony Brook, the lower and upper millstones, um, which ironically covers sort of our traditional region of concern. We had a TMDL that broke it up into the Stony Brook, the upper and lower millstones, and there's a TMDL for the Assunpink. So that was really, really easy and works well. So we've got that. So once you sort of determine your region, you start to pull together your stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? There are some very, very obvious ones. Each town has a stormwater coordinator, which is in charge of making sure the town is in compliance with the MS4 permit. Makes a lot of sense. In many, many towns, it's the municipal engineer. Not always, but it is. So when we started to pull out of the groups, we invited the municipal engineer. We started including a municipal planner if they have those in house. Um, we somewhat, we tried a little bit with the Stony Brooks of inviting the elected officials. I wish I had spent more effort trying to get at least one elected official from each town. Environmental commission members, I think, are very important. We were lucky with the Stony Brook. We had a very engaged member of the Mercer County Planning Department involved. We did not get involved with the county engineer, but I think that's important. And likewise, county commissioners. I think having them in, at least one person in the room, is important. Obviously, self-interest, environmental organizations, we started this process with multiple of these watersheds, and I'm hoping other environmental organizations take up this call and sort of start organizing in their watersheds. Because as Mark mentioned, Montgomery is lucky in that they're all in one watershed, but Lawrence, Jim, you're in at least two different watersheds. So by doing a regional approach for the Stony Brook, Lawrence was then left with how to deal with the other part of their town. Lucky for Lawrence, we decided to do the Assipink as well. Um, but that's a concern. If you join a regional approach, but that only covers half your town, what do you do with the rest? So I'm hoping others will sort of join in and jumpstart the rest. And belatedly in this process, I had conversations with the Water Supply Authority, with American Water, one of the local drinking water providers. Started roping in DEP. DEP was involved in multiple of our Stony Brook meetings in the beginning, uh, but and then I added highway agencies, so the county roads and state DOT. They have to develop watershed improvement plans as well. They're on a slightly different schedule than the municipalities. Public complexes also has their own MS4 permit and has to do their watershed improvement plans on the same schedule. So think maybe county colleges, potentially county administration buildings, correctional facilities, Rutgers, things like that. They may have their own MS4 permit and they have the same schedule as the municipality. So why not bring everyone in the room as possible? Jim, Mark, any thoughts? Any people missing? Any people you think are really, really vital to being in this stakeholder process? I sort of suggested a couple lessons learned from our various approaches, but
No, I think this is a good list. I think of all the potential ones. I really think the stormwater coordinator and the engineer are probably the most important to get on board early, and then they can kind of bring on the stakeholders from their own municipality into the conversation. I also think it's helpful to involve your planning, maybe your local planning board. That typically that group will have a mayor, council on the board, members of their at least a liaison to their environmental commission and others. So I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that. The list you have, it's very comprehensive. You have all the key players. Um, but I think it's something to think about because it's going to vary for, each municipality or everybody who's trying to go with the regional approach. Maybe it's who to include when throughout different points in the process. Because I know, as part of the watershed improvement plan, you're going to do public outreach. In the beginning, you're really trying to get people to get on board to make a decision. So that's where you might need your elected officials, your administrators, and your stormwater coordinator, and the engineer if it's not the same person. And, you know, too many people up front might be overwhelming, but that's just my opinion. Not everybody might share that. But down the road, you're going to need each and every one of these players that you have listed, whether it's involved from the initial decision-making standpoint, from a budgeting perspective, down the road when you're actually working on the draft plan and you want to solicit for feedback, you want those people weighing in.
yeah, very good point. And Mark, you mentioned the township administrator, which isn't on this list. But that's a good addition. And I think it's a very good point. Who comes in and when? Um, which ironically is the next slide. So you've identified your stakeholders, and some of this is a little legwork. So the stormwater coordinator may be identified in the municipal web pages, may not be. As I mentioned, may in fact be the municipal engineer. Not all towns have in-house engineers. Some of them are consulting, but DEP has a list of the consultants. Most towns will list the environmental commission members, their elected officials. To the extent they have in-house professionals, will list them. Not all towns will list their planning board engineer or municipal engineer if they are consultants. So sometimes you need to pick up the phone or send an email to do that. Environmental organizations, we have a list, we have a website where we list all the environmental organizations we are watershed organizations that we're aware of. And then it's reaching a same thing for the counties. Usually there's a directory where you can pull up people and start listing. And the way we've done it over the various groups is we've sent out blanket emails to all the electeds, to the planner, the engineer, especially if they're in-house, inviting them to attend or to send a representative. So I think, that worked well, and, you can sort of add and subtract people. And Mark, you mentioned who do you invite sort of initially? I think that's sort of important. So, as I mentioned, the Stony Brook meetings, started in 2022 after Ida, as a result of Ida. And we did invite elected officials. Not a lot attended. We did have one who attended fairly regularly, but it was usually the engineers, and one which always led for interesting conversations. But the engineers were very, very quick to buy in. And then it became a little bit more work to get the electeds to buy in and move on this. So not to tell tales, but I'm going to. The Stony Brook engineers, 4 of the 6 towns, sort of agreed this was the right way to go and decided to go this route in 2024. And it took several months to get the resolutions working and approved and passed through. So that took a while. But maybe you have an initial meeting with everyone in the room, and then, do some follow-up meetings with the engineers or the planners, etc., and sort of work through it. But I think maybe in the beginning, I don't know. My thought is to do a big group in the meeting, get all the information out there, so everyone can hear the questions and the information. But I don't know. Mark, Jim, what do you think? Big group, small group?
Well, I mean, I like the idea of initially starting with a big group just to let people kind of get educated on the topic a little bit. But I think it really falls back to your stormwater coordinator or your engineer or administrator to kind of take the lead with their own municipality and figure out who they should bring in, depending on the politics in that town.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Jim. Um, you definitely want that feedback up front, and then you want that educational component too, because when we did our initial meeting um, last year, it was completely for educational purposes. It was explaining the requirements, the deadlines, why we're doing this, and to start that initial um, prep for advocacy. We want to pull everybody in. Later as you start, moving to your meetings down the road, you might pare it down a little bit to the decision makers, because that's when you really want to hone it in and find out, who's on board, who's going to collaborate with who, and in which manner.
Yeah. So sometimes it's, I don't want to say, each town is going to be a little bit different. As I said, some towns have in-house engineers. Sometimes it is an outside consultant. and the town would have to pay that consultant to come. Sometimes there is a key elected official or environmental commission member who could really shepherd through the process of the municipality. And a little bit is knowing your municipalities. Some of it is trial and error. And then, so information to be shared. So with the initial meeting, what we've tried to do when we started these meetings is sort of what I've done right now. Go through the MS4 permit a little bit on the watershed improvement plans, talk about the water impairments, talk about TMDLs. We usually have a map of the towns in the watershed. We have a map of the impervious cover within the watershed. So there's sort of an understanding of what's going on. Obviously, the waterways that are in the town and the watershed. We've done impervious cover analysis, so we know how much impervious cover is in each town and within the watershed. So overall, that's sort of what we've put in our various presentations. Uh, Jim, this may go back a few years, and Mark, a little more recent. What information were you looking for when you first joined these meetings? What information did you find helpful? What did you wish was presented and had to be provided after the fact?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question because, back when we started talking about it, I think, Mike, I mean, I think really you guys were a little bit ahead of the curve thinking in the watershed, kind of organizing these meetings and planning for the new regulations. I think we kind of probably weren't entirely ready for. So, yeah, I think we had the right information. It was just a lot of uncertainty on exactly how the process would work. What would the DEP requirements actually be at the time? I think now it's a little bit more clear. I think people are a little more educated on what's going to be required. So people are starting to plan a little bit differently and budget additional money for the kind of requirements that we have now.
Yeah, I think leading up to the MS4 permit changes, and we know something's going to change every 5 years when they release the new permit. We knew what the changes were going to be. Um, but I think one thing that we're missing, and I don't think it's fault of anybody in this room, is we need some kind of a model. Like generally, I like to think when rule changes are coming, we're going to be given some of the tools to at least get started. So, if the models and samples were available a little earlier, I think that would help kickstart the process a little bit sooner. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And Jim, fair comments. When we started the Stony Brook in early 2022, the genesis of that was Hurricane Ida, which caused substantial damage within the watershed, and trying to pull the towns just to have informal conversations. Sort of inside baseball concept here. The stormwater rules that's been around since 2004 actually have the ability to develop a regional stormwater management control ordinance, or a regional approach. But that was in the sort of the regulations. The whip itself didn't really come into fruition until later in 2022, and then actually was in the MS4 permit in 2023. So it's sort of involved. It's sort of the same thing with the Ass and Pink. We brought the towns together to deal with informally, and then it sort of morphed into this more regulatory, how do we meet the requirements in a more efficient manner? And then Mark, to your point of it would have been great to have sort of these guides and templates ahead of time. Absolutely agree. Which is why I put out this guide, trying to lessons learned. We've done two sessions at our watershed conference talking about this approach, but thought sort of put out the guide DEP put out their sort of template for the watershed improvement plans last year, and I think they are working on a guide to what a watershed assessment report would look like as we speak. But yeah, so our hope is, and after this webinar, we're going to be releasing our guide, sort of the thought process we used to put all this together, some of those lessons learned. And then, where did we get the information? So a lot of it is publicly available. ArcGIS, the DEP's GeoWeb, the integrated reports are on DEP's website. They also have a TMDL lookup tool on their website. Some of that information is in the guide, where to find it. So pulling that stuff together, you have to have someone who knows GIS. It's not super hard, and a lot of it is publicly available and free tools. Not always all, but very, very useful. And one of those questions I should have mentioned, those TMDLs were prepared by DEP or by a consultant hired by DEP, who puts those TMDLs together. And then one of the, again, lessons sort of we learned, we set up meetings roughly quarterly. Sometimes it didn't happen quarterly, but we didn't have a method for communications in between. We tried very, very informally with the Stony Brook, having a Google Drive shared folder so people could have information. We've set up since SharePoint sites where information can reside and try to push out information through Outlook group lists. But I think one of the things is regular communication with the groups, with the individuals in those groups, so everyone knows what's going on, so they know things are still happening, and reminding the group is meeting. And as I mentioned, we try to do the meetings quarterly. Since the watershed assessment reports are due, at the end of next year, quarterly may not be frequent enough to get the ball rolling. You may need some level of a monthly meeting going forward until you get everything moving. Or you maybe, and it doesn't have to be monthly meetings with the entire group. Maybe it's with the subgroup, with the stormwater coordinators or the engineers, or, the people who really are invested in moving the process forward. And then sort of less frequently with the decision makers, the township administrator, township attorney, things like that, to get the buy-in, get the resolutions drafted and moving forward. Jim, Mark, any thoughts on, communications and frequency?
Yeah, your timelines were spot on, because I think that's what we were talking about when Montgomery and the Watershed Institute were hosting the work group meetings for the Lower Millstone. I think if you go past quarterly, you're not going to see any kind of effective turnaround. And it depends what your goals are for each of the meetings, like for what you should set the frequency at. But I would say definitely no less than a month, or well, you could, but ideally a month, 2 months, but no more than quarterly.
Yeah, I agree. I can't think of much to add to that. I would say too, people are getting used to virtual meetings. I think that's probably, I see that as a question up there. That's definitely something, I would encourage. I think when you have a bigger group, while it's always better to meet in person, it's just hard to get that many people in the room when you need to. So I think people are more willing to put less time eliminating the travel and participating if it's virtual.
Yeah. I put that in, and we have within my staff a different opinion whether virtual or in person is important. The Stony Brook meetings were always virtual,
Right.
and they were always during the day. The Assunpink, we did our initial meeting on a weekend in person. And then we did the next 2 meetings in person during the work week, with mixed success. The both Upper and Lower Millstone, the initial meetings were in person. And I thought that worked really well, but they were later in the day, I think 4 o'clock. So not quite after work hours, but not quite during, towards the end, because we were trying to get that sort of mix of people. Um, so, I personally like virtual. It's much easier to attend, especially during the day. Um, but there are things you can get done in person, side conversations, and just seeing body language that in person is a lot easier. Um, and then don't want to have it in here, but morning or night, I mean, during the day or evening, again, depends. If you're trying to get the electeds there, much easier, I think, in the evenings than during the day. If you're working with, township professionals, during the day is a lot easier. Um, and, you may want to mix and match. All right, let me just make sure. And someone mentioned the stormwater coordinator list should be in the municipalities, stormwater prevention, pollution prevention plan. I think just want to make sure before we move forward with anything else. All right. So the next question. So you've got your first meeting going, you've got buy-in. There's a couple things that really need to be figured out. And the process for the Assapink, the Stony Brook, and the Lower Millstone, the Watershed Institute reached out to a consultant to come up with a proposal. This is what we're going to do. This is what it's going to cost. You may not always do that. You may decide to do the concept and then do an RFP, a request for proposals for a consultant. So you bid it out. Um, and you sort of figure that out. But you have to figure out who's going to be the person to contract with the consultant. Is it going to be a municipality? Is it going to be the county? One of the things we talked about with the Stony Brook towns was the county was interested or willing to be the agent contracting with the consultant and was going to do shared services agreements with the municipalities. You can do a county doing that with shared service agreements with municipalities outside the county. So Mercer County could have done it with the Amwells who were in Hunterdon County. Montgomery has decided, assuming everyone buys in, Montgomery is going to hire the consultant and do some version of shared services agreements with the municipalities. Correct, Mark?
Sorry, my audio cut out for a
Oh,
minute.
so Montgomery's decided you're going to contract with the consultant and do shared services agreements with the municipalities that buy in.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, Montgomery Township's committee had authorized us to take the lead on the contract, and that was kind of, what I had suggested as a potential kickstart to the initiative. And, some people seem to be receptive of that. I think, not everybody wants to be managing it on the day to day. It is typically easier if you have somebody trying to spearhead it. But there's so many different ways to look at it. You can either have each municipality contract with the consultant directly, or, try to do some form of a shared service agreement between the municipalities. I think it really just depends on how many groups you're working with as part of the region, what works for you. Because there's definitely not one size fits all
Yeah.
solution to that.
Yeah. The Stony Brook towns ended up, and the consultant agreed to do individual contracts with the town to develop the 4 towns to do one plan. Um, I can't speak for the consultants, but I think doing 13 separate contracts might be in 13 separate billings might be a little more challenging. For the Assunpink, the Watershed Institute applied for a DEP grant. So if that grant comes in, we would be retaining the consultant. But so there's a lot of different ways to do that, but you've got to figure out the mechanism, shared services agreements, individual contracts. How's that going to work? And then allocating the cost for the study. How do you allocate the cost? So you're going to get a cost. And one of the ways, we started this with the Stony Brook. There was multiple ways to allocate the cost of developing the watershed assessment report. We talked about, well, how many acres? How big is your town? Maybe that's the number. I think we very briefly talked about, well, 6 towns, divide the cost by 6. We talked per capita. So how many people are in each town? And we just divide that. And then what we decided in the Stony Brook through discussion was figure out what is the impervious cover of the town within that watershed. And then we would allocate that amongst the town. So if 15%, as town 2 here is within the watershed, you would pay 15% of that cost, assuming everyone participates. And the thought was that impervious cover is very highly correlated with the MS4, which is regulating urban development and stormwater management. So that would make a lot of sense. It's probably not a perfect allocation because you might have stormwater from very old developments that aren't being managed versus new, but without doing a ton of study to figure out a more accurate way, that is the way, at least we've approached it with the watershed groups that we've been meeting with. Jim, Mark, any thoughts on that as an allocation method versus any other?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
think,
go ahead.
Jim, you could start.
I was just gonna say, I think we had considered a few different alternatives that were discussed there, but I have to agree. I mean, the idea of impervious surface made the most sense. I think it reflects the impact each town has on the watershed. So it's fair, and as long as you can get the participation from the larger towns that have that impervious coverage, I think it works well. The only problem will be is if a town doesn't participate, who's one of the larger areas with the most impervious coverage. That could be problematic.
Yeah, it seems to be a good way to disperse the load because if you do it based on the acreage of the municipality, that just doesn't make sense to me because not every square foot of that area is built out. I mean, you might get other municipalities that have different zoning regulations that allow higher percents of lot coverage or impervious surface, but other municipalities might not have that. I mean, using Montgomery as an example, we've had a long-standing aggressive open space program where we're almost at 40% of preserved open space in the township. So like those are lands that can't be developed. So they would not typically have your impervious surfaces. It helps focus it, more on like a distribution on, what's causing the runoff, what's causing the pollutants. So it definitely makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And then, Jim, you put it on ahead, what's the critical mass? How many towns have to participate? Or how much of the impervious cover has to participate? For the Stony Brook, we had 4 of the 6 towns participate. The 2 towns that did not was, I think, a total of 9% impervious cover. So that was, and I wasn't involved in the internal meetings within the towns, but I think that was very easy to reallocate that 9%. But if a bigger town decides not to participate, if you have, town number 5, which is almost 21% of the impervious cover in this example, if they don't participate, reallocating that 21%, or if town 3, which is almost 31%, doesn't participate, reallocating those costs then become, I think, a much different conversation internally.
Right.
So getting the buy-in from the big impervious cover, I think, is very important. And how do we get that buy-in from all the towns? So some of the things, we have run into as we have been approaching this was, well, this only covers 40% of my town. I've got 60% of my town I have to deal with. Again, one of the hopes I have is that this process, this concept is taken over by others and replicated, so that that other 60% is actually taken care of with another regional approach. Um, and it doesn't have to be environmental organizations. It could be municipalities banding together. I would hope that, Jacobs Creek and Hopewell and Ewing, you know, they may band together and just do that watershed together. Um, but how do we have that conversation with others to move that forward and get buy-in from those who might be more reluctant? Um, any thoughts?
Well, I guess initially we have to figure out, what is what's the issue with the towns that don't want to participate.
Mhm.
I think in the beginning it might have been funding. Maybe they weren't prepared in their yearly budget for the impact that this would have. Whereas now maybe people are a little more aware, I guess, of the requirements a little bit further along, and maybe they'll have that money set aside. So then it becomes more of a decision of, is this a good idea or is it not? And I think, certainly, as engineers, we could talk about that. And I think convince people that it will save money and it will give them more opportunity. And it's kind of important too to get an opportunity to collaborate with the people, your counterparts in your adjacent municipalities. There's not that many opportunities to do that, and this is an area where that can be a pretty positive experience. So.
I like something that Jim said because it made me think of something because everybody does have their challenges. I think some municipalities might be behind where there's a little bit more of a heavy lift where they can't necessarily just jump right into the watershed improvement plan right away. Like if some are further behind with their mapping or some of the other things that they got to catch up on, that could have a big impact. The financial aspects, definitely. And I know for some of those municipalities that were tier B that were converted to tier A, that probably just threw a whole bunch of extra hurdles their way they weren't prepared to handle. But,
Yeah.
if you could fabricate some of the relationships or even, try to pull people in, and take some of the workload off them, even if they're dealing with multiple different watersheds, maybe they'll be more amenable to, jumping on board if they realize like, oh, okay, somebody's going to try to help me with this portion because they already have to look at that as part of their assessment. That could be one avenue.
Yeah. So I think a lot of that, and I think both of you said some things I want to elaborate on. You know, One, everyone's going to have to do this. So there's going to cost for you to do it, for you to manage each town managing a contract. If you have one contract, you have some level of reduced overload oversight. We'll probably not be repeating. Each town won't be doing the same studies over and over and over again. So we're having one. So theoretically, the cost to develop this plan may be less expensive. Um, if you're really doing a watershed plan, if what you're doing, no offense to the engineers, if what you're doing is doing an engineering study, uh, looking very, very narrowly and not holistically, um, that might be cheaper. But if you're really looking at the watershed, if you're looking at a regional approach to solving the problems, I think we'll see savings in developing the plan. But I also think, and I mentioned earlier, if you look at the region and look at the region for the solutions versus each town individually, you now have opportunities to develop regional projects where multiple municipalities contribute to the project. You will likely receive better reductions at a lower cost than if each town had to develop their own. One of the meetings, one of the council members said, my town has very little infiltration. So to get infiltration to reduce volumes and to address that will be very expensive. But if I can contribute money to a project that does infiltration where it works well, be more than happy to do that because it will benefit my municipality. So by looking at where are the best opportunities at the least cost, I think at the end, when we start actually building these, we'll have a huge benefit. And then I think, Mark, you mentioned much earlier, these regulations, these permits change over time. I suspect if DEP sees these programs, these WIPs not actually resulting improvements, we'll have additional regulations and additional steps to take. So if we can nip that in the bud and get things in the ground that are working, we may save money in the long run. And I think getting buy-in from those towns that may be hesitant, sitting down, figuring out what those hesitations are. Is it I just don't have the capacity to think about it? Is it I'm still working on my inventory report and I don't know what to do? Is it well, I've got another half of my town. How do I address that? Um, sitting down, having individual meetings, whether that's the organizer of the stakeholder meetings, is it, engineer to engineer, is it elected official to elected official? Um, I think having those conversations and working through those are important. Time consuming, but important. Let's talk a little bit about how did you get your towns to yes? How did you get your towns to pass the resolution, adopting a regional approach, hiring a consultant, and starting to move this process forward?
Well, well, I guess, for Lawrence, I guess it wasn't that challenging. I think our governing body they were engaged on the topic. I think anytime that you talk about a shared service, they're very excited about that opportunity. We had already planned ahead in the budget, so we had money allocated, so it wasn't a situation where we needed to go back and ask for more. So I think when it came time, to do that resolution or to get that contract approved, they were very encouraged by the process, and we didn't have much convincing to do.
It was the same for Montgomery as well. I've also had the watershed improvement plan as part of my department's budget plan for the last couple of years. So I think, some of them already knew it was coming. Some of the elected officials had actually participated in the work group meetings, so they were already aware and in support of the idea. Um, plus I think, a couple of years ago when Ida happened, we had a few residents displaced as a result of Hurricane Ida. So, the flooding had already been a topic of concern. So, push came to shove and we put the resolution in front of the governing body. I think it made the decision a little easier for them.
Yeah, I think flooding, from a legal perspective, water quality is the legal hook of why DEP is able to require this. Flooding is, I think, getting people in municipalities to understand that this will help reduce flooding. It may not eliminate flooding, the Idas of the world, um, we had 6, 7, 8 inches of rain in about an hour last August 6th. Um, you're not going to stop that, but if you can reduce it significantly and make those catastrophic flooding issues less frequent, um, I think it will be much easier for buy-in from the community and for the elected officials. But yeah, so all right. And thoughts on who should be doing the outreach to the sort of hesitant municipalities? Should be engineer to engineer, engineer to municipal, elected official. Should it be the convener? Should be your friendly local watershed association sitting down and having these conversations, or is it really highly dependent?
I think you can hit it from a few different standpoints. Like have the engineers talk to the engineers, have the electeds call their counterparts. I mean, some of them already have those relationships, or know who can help facilitate them if they haven't like discussed anything with one another before. I mean, we got to keep in mind that some of these people have probably met before, some may have not.
Mhm.
It's better to try to reach out to your counterparts and on the same level. I think it's a little easier that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Mike, I mean, as you know, I mean, you kind of organized the watersheds in our area, and I think without that, it would have been difficult. It does take someone or a group to take the lead and reach out to everybody and try to assemble them. If you leave it just to one calling the other, it's going to be very difficult to pull together. So it does take someone some leadership.
Jim, thank you. And
Yeah.
um, it takes a lot. I mean, the conversations we've had during all these meetings, you know, y'all were convincing each other to do this. So it made the job of convening very easy. All right. Yeah, and so just a little bit, you get the buy-in from the participants, you get the yes from the electeds, you get a resolution passed, whether it is to hire the consultant and do shared services agreements, to enter into a shared service agreement with someone else. We'll have a sample of a resolution that some towns have used in the guide to do that. Some of this sort of lesson learned, but there is a sense of urgency. Let's see. We have a few more minutes and wanted to see if there's any questions. Um, so there was discussion about really it being non-point source versus point source. I think the MS4 permit is all about point sources. Um, you may find a lot of bang for your buck of doing projects controlling non-point sources. But at least in my opinion, my mind, the legal hook of why we're doing this, what we can regulate is the point sources, the MS4 system. And I think, we never talked about this, but, project wise, my hope is we do a lot of restoration so that we create more capacity in our streams to allow for floodplain restoration and floods to spread out. I'm hoping we have, and I suspect a lot of our watershed assessment reports will have a lot of naturalizing and updating of existing basins because that's low hanging fruit. If the basin already exists, was built in the 80s, maybe we should be removing the concrete low flow channels and naturalizing those basins. Maybe there's a lot of deferred maintenance on our basins that we can get up to speed through enforcement from privately owned systems and doing that. Let's see. Um, So the MS4 system doesn't really address factories or industrial waste. They have their own discharge permits. Um, so not that you might not be able to get some reductions from those, even if they're in compliance with their permit, but just like we might be able to see a lot of benefits from getting non-point source, getting better practices on our farmland so you have less runoff from them. Um, that overall will help. Um, I think the question about whether road surfaces are included in the impervious cover analysis, I believe so. And as I mentioned, roads, if they are county or state, have their own MS4 permit and they have to do these watershed improvement plans, which is another reason why I think involving the counties early, bringing them in, they are another stakeholder. They have to do these as well. they would benefit from joining these regional approaches because they're going to have to do it anyway. So bringing them in now, contributing to regional projects that help everyone, I think that works will work a lot better. And then I think the last question, does water monitoring play a role in the watershed improvement planning? So a couple things. So we had advocated early on that we do water quality monitoring ahead of time before we develop these plans. The watershed improvement plan on the MS4 permit doesn't require it ahead of time, but given that the TMDLs in some instances are very old, the Raritan Basin TMDL was using early 2000 data. Trying to figure out where you really are now and then plan for that made a whole lot of sense. It's not technically required. If you develop a formal watershed management plan, a 9-element watershed management plan, water quality monitoring is absolutely part of that. But there is sort of built-in water quality monitoring after the fact. So the MS4 permit requires that these watershed improvement plans get updated when a new integrated water quality assessment report comes out. So in 2026, we may have, or 2028, we may have a new integrated report, which then will show some waters may have improved, some waters may have gotten worse. And how do we adjust our watershed improvement plans to account for those changes? Again, if a new TMDL comes out, how do we incorporate that new TMDL into the process? So I think water quality monitoring is there indirectly. It may be beneficial to do ahead of time so you know where you are depending on the age of the data. So yeah, so I think I've covered a lot, probably not all of the questions. Um, what level of HUC, the hydrologic unit code. Um, I think that sort of varies. As I mentioned earlier, going to the HUC 14 may be too small. The basin level is too large. So somewhere in between. And I think some of that is dependent. Do you have enough municipalities with enough impervious cover within that watershed? You're supposed to look at the watersheds on a HUC 14, I think, level. So do you have enough of those to make a regional approach worthwhile? All right. With that, we're just about at time. If you have questions that we didn't cover, please reach out to me. I will try to address them. Jim, Mark, any last words, any last thoughts?
Not for me. I appreciate the opportunity to participate. It was very helpful, hopefully, to everybody.
Yeah, no, this was time well spent. I think the more we can learn about how to collaborate, like even if it's just getting ideas from each other, I mean, that's definitely something I'd like to get feedback on from just about anybody. If anybody has good ideas on top of anything past what was presented today, we're all ears because as we're going through this, just like the slide says, we've learned a few lessons. So, if there's anything we're not thinking about, I would definitely like to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, I think you added township administrator to my list of stakeholders. I didn't have that in there. I don't know why I didn't have it in there, but I didn't, because we've had township administrators participate. So just a little bit wrap up. We will be sending out the completed guide. So there's the table of contents there. Sometime next week. I was hoping to finish it, but I had some formatting issues. So we'll be sending out a guide. How do we replicate this process? How do other towns, counties, environmental organizations take this concept, roll with it so that we get more regional approaches versus 565 individualized plans that don't talk to each other? You will be able to find the guide on our website. We have a professional resources page and a watershed improvement plan page. So that information will be there. Again, we'll be sending out this PowerPoint, this recording, a link to the recording at least to everyone. And I want to mention a little bit down the road, we do have our Watershed Conference where we've talked about these regional approaches for the last 2 years. Might be a topic again for next year. Haven't decided. We have a request for proposals out. So if you're interested in submitting a proposal for our Watershed Conference, it is in February 27th, 2026. So keep that on your schedule. And if you need to reach out to me, please, there's my contact information. Please do that. I try to get as many questions as possible. But with that, Jim, Mark, thank you very much for your help today, your thoughts. Thank you for your participation in the regional approaches over the last several years and really, taking it and promoting it. So I appreciate that. I think if we do more of these, we will have a much better product at the end of the day, and we'll actually start achieving reduction of floodwaters and improved water quality. So again, Jim and Mark, again, thank you very much. Everyone who has attended, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you all later. Thank you. Have a good
Thank you.
afternoon.
Take care.
Bye.